Hi, my name is Ranger Jackson, and welcome to the national park that doesn't exist. That's what I greet all of my tour guests with, though technically it isn't true. I work as the only tour guide at the aptly named Forest National Park, though we usually just call it the Forest. And it does exist. In fact, if you've ever been near the western half of Canada, you've visited the park and probably even met me. But the moment you left, poof, memory gone. Why? Well, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. But it just has that effect. Outside of the park, no one except the government knows about it. Yet, it has this draw that brings in thousands of tourists every year. In order to keep these tourists from getting lost, they need a small group of people to live here full-time to keep things in check. I'm one of those full-timers, and have been for a little over a decade now. We just got the internet here about a month ago, and I've been trying to figure it out in my spare time. Well, got the internet. We've been asking for it for years. But our manager, Julie, is a stickler and only gives us absolute necessities. Once a month, Julie walks out to the edge of the park and speaks to someone on the outside with a two-way radio. Then a week later, in come the government guys with a truck full of provisions. We've tried asking them for stuff, but since the transient government guys don't remember we exist, much less our requests, it's a futile effort. Luckily, some hippie with a weird satellite dish on his van showed up. He hasn't returned to his van since then, so I figured he wouldn't mind if I borrowed his stuff while he wasn't using it. Lots of people on this page have fun, scary stories, so I thought I'd share a few of my own from my time here. I guess to start, I should probably explain what exactly Forest National Park is. Forest National Park is 50,265 acres big, but that only encompasses the memory effects part. The forest proper is a circular, 5-mile diameter section that gets deeper the further you go into it. Literally deeper, as in the trees get taller, thicker, and block out more of the sun the further you go. We keep the edges cleared so we don't accidentally wander into that part. Whenever one of us goes past that point, we call it a dive, and it's something I do daily. We don't measure distance traveled in there by miles or kilometers, but rather by the illuminance or lux of wherever you are. Actual distance gets a little bit wonky inside the forest. You can walk for hours and leave only feet from where you entered, or for minutes and be miles and miles away from home. We refer to our depth in the forest by the oceanic zones: sunlight, twilight, midnight, abyssal, and hadal. As you can imagine, traversing within the zones gets more dangerous the deeper you get, mostly because of the wildlife. We're kind of like Yellowstone in that way. The only things that are considered to be safe zones in there are streams which run through all the zones because, for whatever reason, distance is exact and the forest is a little calmer around them. Okay, story time. I usually do my tours down the East Stream because it's the easiest to traverse, but sometimes I'll have a particularly advanced group of hikers who I feel can take on the challenge of the North Stream. Last time I did it was about a year and a half ago. A group showed up in a whole caravan of cars, dressed up to the nines in fancy hiking gear. I felt frankly underdressed in my green fleece ranger uniform and Stetson hat. They were very lively and enthusiastic, brimming with questions as I ran them through what the park was and what they were going to see. I tried showing them the well-trodden East Stream Trail, but I guess I went a little bit overboard on my showboating while explaining everything because I was immediately met with looks of disappointment. Now, I've never been one to let a good tour group down, so I said, "Alright, I don't usually do this, but since you all look far more experienced than most tour groups I get out here, we're going to go to the North Stream entrance instead." This got them excited again, and we headed around the perimeter towards the North Stream. The reason why I don't usually take tours down it is for two reasons. First, it's much further away from the visitor center and I am just a little bit lazy. And second, it's a thinner, steeper stream that's much more rocky than the East. It not only increases the chances of people twisting or breaking things, but at certain points there are especially steep areas that require alternate routes that go away from the stream and into the forest. Even though the detours don't leave the sightline of the stream, going any distance into the tree line on either side is risky, even in the brighter zones. Everything was fine for most of the hike. In fact, I was having a lot of fun with this tour group. They were telling me stories from the hiking trip they were on in the Canadian Rockies. They had left out of Vancouver earlier that week and were stopping at every major hiking destination they could on their way to Alaska. One of the members of their group was someone they had met on one of their hikes and had decided to join their caravan. He was a scrawny kid, couldn't have been barely out of his parents' house, and he was quiet to the point of near invisibility. He stayed towards the back of the group and only spoke when spoken to. Since I wasn't used to going down the North Stream, and by consequence didn't have natural waypoints guiding me, we went much deeper than I usually take tour groups. I was having too much fun to notice how dark it had gotten. We were approaching another small waterfall that would require taking a detour around a tree with the trunk the width of a school bus when the kid spoke up. "Hey, can we, turn around?" He was jittering nervously and wore an expression of apprehension. I wasn't sure just how deep we were, so I told everyone to turn off their flashlights for a moment and I pulled out my lux meter. It read 0.062 lux. We were deep in the twilight zone of the forest, a whole 3 lux or about a mile, deeper than I usually take people. "Sorry guys, we have to turn around. You all got a longer tour than those tickets are worth," I told them. The group put up some light resistance, but followed along behind me obediently. The kid no longer walked at the back, but instead right behind me. Even though we were making our way back, he seemed to be getting more scared, making whimpering noises at intervals. The forest has some weird effects on people's psyche, and it was clearly targeting him. I've had plenty of people on my tours get scared, break down crying, hallucinate, even try climbing up trees to get out of the forest, so I knew this kid was on the verge of snapping. As we approached another waterfall that would require a detour into the forest, I stopped and turned to the kid to try to calm him. Just as I opened my mouth, the sound of cracking wood rang from the forest behind us. In what seemed like the same instant, the kid shoved me to the side, sending me sprawling into the creek. A couple folks ran to me and helped me out of the creek. I wasn't able to see him run into the woods in time, but I was able to stop the people who had chased after him. Once everyone was in order, we stood in silence for a long minute listening for the kid or whatever had made the noise. Eventually I said, "Follow me as quietly as possible, stay calm, and don't stray off of my path." A woman in the group spoke up, pointing into the forest. "What about him?" "My main goal right now is to get all of you out safely. He's probably just ahead of us." So we walked around the falls and back to the stream, the sound of our boots crunching over detritus almost deafening over the utter silence of the forest. "Hey!" I whipped around and saw everyone looking into the forest. There was the kid, standing just at the edge of what our flashlights could reach. The man who had yelled was waving his arms in the air and shouting at him, "Hey, over here! Stop, hey, stop!" I spoke above him. He turned to me indignant. "Why, he's right there." "He heard you. He can follow us if he wants. I told you to stay quiet and follow me." Fortunately, he seemed to understand the gravity of my words and shut up. As we walked, the kid seemed to be following us, gradually moving closer to us as we walked. A couple minutes later, a woman in the group gasped and pointed at him. I've seen a lot in my time working here. Not much really gets to me anymore, but my blood ran cold when I saw what made her gasp. The kid was much closer than before, but he wasn't walking with us. Rather, his legs dangled, feet dragging along the ground. I heard stifled sobs of fear behind me and picked up the pace. All at once, I became aware of a noise emanating from the kid. It was less of a sound and more of a feeling, a pounding in my chest, like a bass drum at a rock concert, the footfalls of something massive. I turned again to find the kid less than 20 yards away. His face revealed nothing, a look of utter neutrality, but just below it his neck was distended grotesquely as a spear. The diameter of a forearm and black as midnight protruded from it. It was impossible to see where it went, or what it was attached to, only that it was there by the way blood bubbled from the seam. Shortly after, he turned and lifted off the ground, disappearing into the darkness above us. The rest of the hike was calm, besides a few members of the tour group openly crying. When we resurfaced, I didn't even have a chance to get a word off before they broke into a sprint, piling into their respective cars and tearing out of the lot. While, I don't know, I can guess what happened to them after that. They left the park boundary and forgot. They probably think that that kid chickened out and left their caravan, completely unaware of his fate. I wish I was so lucky. The kid's car is still in the parking lot. There's a lot of cars in our parking lot at any given time. Makes us look much more busy than we actually are. I asked one of the government guys once why they don't just take them, and he said something about waiting until it doesn't look suspicious. I guess that makes sense. Though I don't know why it's an issue if no one knows this place exists. It's not my choice either way. I have to get back to work. I see a car pulling in now, and I think Julie would get mad if she caught me loitering around this van. I have a lot more stories, and I hope I can share some more of them here before the Gov guys take this van. Until next time. Hello again, I'm Ranger Jackson, and I work at the national park that doesn't exist. I'm glad that most people were able to remember the story. I was worried that the internet would forget too once I sent the post out. I guess it works the same way as Julie's walkie-talkies though. One of you was interested in the stories of the other cars that are in the parking lot, and to be honest, I don't know what happened to the majority of those people. Not to brag, but not many people die on my tours. Most of our disappearances happen because people believe they don't need a guide to navigate the forest and wander off on their own. We don't see them come here, we don't know what happens to them, and they don't ever leave. That being said, there was one abandoned car whose owner was seen again. This was during summer, a couple years back. One day, after bringing a tour group back, I noticed a new car sitting in the lot. The owner was already gone. At this point, I don't even question new cars showing up. It's always the same conclusion. Sometime later, the government guys just take it away. I assumed that this one would be no different. A week or so later, Smith, the park scientist, asked me to accompany him on a dive to explore geologic features adjacent to the East Stream on the boundary of the sunlight and twilight zones. Usually I don't do any of that exploratory stuff because that's what did in Ranger Daniels. But I used to have a lot of respect for Smith, and I didn't want to leave him alone to the whims of the forest. We started out shortly after 3 p.m., and our plan was to be out by 8:30 before the sun set. When our lux meters read 10, just on the edge of the twilight zone, we placed a stake on the bank of the East Stream and made our way into the southern tree line. I really wish I could say that some weird things happened, but it was about as ordinary as something can be when you're working in near darkness among trees taller than skyscrapers. To be entirely honest, I was bored. It didn't help that I know next to nothing about geology, so I just had to stand by while Smith was poking at rocks half buried in pine needles with all sorts of scientific equipment. I took to using my binoculars to look around for something to do. I didn't expect to see anything because where we were is deeper than most normal wildlife stray and too shallow for the other wildlife. But I noticed movement far off in a deeper part of the forest. I thought at first that it was some trick of the forest, but there, weaving through the trees like a drunkard, was a distinctly human silhouette. Without taking my gaze off the figure, I moved over to Smith and hit him to get his attention. "Hey, watch it," Smith said. Then, noticing what I was doing, he stood and asked, "What is it?" "I want to make sure I'm not going crazy. Get out your binoculars." He grumbled something about not being cryptic and looked out into the trees. "Well, that's no animal I know of." "Do you think it's a person? Like an actual person?" "Let's not chase after, if just in case it's not. Get your gun out." I pulled my service pistol out its holster and held it at my side. It was close enough now that I could tell it was a woman, and she looked much worse for wear. She seemed to be moving with some purpose, looking up to the treetops before stumbling to a tree to the left, then to the right, and repeating. The movements felt far too human to be a farce, but I've seen a lot that felt real and ended up being a trick. She was on track to miss us some 40 yards to the south. She seems legitimate. I don't think it's right to leave someone for dead even if it's 50/50ths that it's a trick, I said. Smith scoffed. Fine, Daniels. Hand me your gun and go risk your life. I'll stay here. After glaring at him for his morbid joke, I handed him the gun and walked towards her. Once I was about 30 yards away, I called out to her, "Are you all right?" She jumped and turned to me, a look of primal fear in her eyes. She stood frozen, as if waiting for me to make a move before she could decide what to do. I raised my hands to show that I meant no harm, and she seemed to relax. When she spoke, her voice came out scratchy.
Where am I?
You're in Forest National Park. I'm Ranger Jackson. I pointed towards Smith. That's Smith. We're going to get you out of here. I turned to Smith and waved him over to us. The woman hunched over and crouch walked over to me, reaching a hand up tentatively to grab my shoulder. Her eyes got wide and under her breath she muttered,
You are real.
Yep, now just follow us. We know the way out of here, all right? She nodded and straightened up a little bit more. Smith seemed annoyed that we were leaving earlier than he had intended, but the woman seemed grateful that we were helping her out. On our way, we asked her some questions and learned that her name was Grace, and it was her car that had showed up a week ago. Whenever we tried to ask about her time in the forest, though, she would clam up. As we got further into the sunlight zone, it was no wonder why. She was covered in scrapes and bruises, though, strangely, her skin was a sickly gray and wrinkled, like those hairless cats. I figured that it was just because of the humidity, but it rubbed me the wrong way. When we resurfaced, we took Grace into the visitor center to get her food, water, and medical attention. I wanted to get her to leave immediately, since nothing we could do could help her as much as leaving the park and forgetting ever being here. But Smith wanted to keep her for questioning, since he hadn't met someone who had spent a week in the forest and lived to tell the tale. I tried to argue, but Smith went so far as to threaten to get me fired. Getting fired is a fate worse than death, and Smith absolutely had the power to do it, so I had to concede. I left the visitor center, and it wasn't until 3 days later that I got any news. First thing in the morning as I was getting dressed for the day, I got a knock on my cabin door. It was Smith. Without so much as a hello, he said, "I can't get anything out of her. She asked for you." Then he turned, and without looking back started walking towards the research building. I followed him to the building and through its sterile hallways to an unmarked door which he unceremoniously opened to reveal Grace, bound to an interrogation table with handcuffs. She looked terrified, staring at her hands and rocking back and forth. Without a word, Smith pushed me into the room and slammed the door behind me. Before I could do anything, Grace looked up and her face slowly stretched into a smile.
Ranger Jackson, your friend is a very bad man.
Smith is not my friend. What has he done to you? I said, backing towards the door. I knew she was restrained, but something about her smile made me feel like I was in immediate danger.
What hasn't he done, Jack? He wants me to tell him about the forest and he'll do anything for the information. But you, what do you want, Jack?
My back slammed into the door, handle digging into my spine. Maintaining eye contact, I tried the door. Locked. I cursed under my breath and consigned to my fate, walking to the interrogation table and sitting down across from Grace. I want to get you out of here, out of Forest National Park.
Why?
When you leave the forest, all your memories of it go away. I can tell you are distressed. I think it would be best if you forgot your visit here. In a flash, her face transformed. She lunged towards me. In a panic, I kicked backwards, flipping my chair. I hit the ground hard and scrambled backwards.
What makes you think I want to forget?
In the next moment, her face relaxed into a smile again, and she looked at me in amusement as I laid on the ground trying to catch my breath.
Look at you. All you've seen and you're still scared of something just like you. Don't you want to be just like Smith? Don't you want to learn more?
I shakily picked myself up and walked a few steps back from the table. I noticed that the skin around her wrist where the handcuffs were attached had peeled back, and blood was spilling onto the table. I just do my job. I'm not a scientist. Grace sat back down, an almost professional demeanor taking over, despite the deranged smile across her face.
I know. That's why I wanted you here. I'll tell you what I know because I know you won't benefit from it. Please, sit.
Hesitantly, I picked up the chair and placed it some distance from the table before sitting.
Good. Ranger Jackson, what do you remember from before you came here?
For a moment, I mentally stumbled as I tried to recall what came before the forest for the first time in years. I knew of the world outside, locations, events, cultures, facts, but I had no memories attached to any of them. I found my earliest memory to be feeling nervous as Ranger Daniels taught me the ropes of being a tour guide. I guess I don't have any. Grace nodded.
That's right. The forest is pruning your mind. It's a gardener, clearing weeds for a new, beautiful bed of roses. It's doing the same for me, and I am open to its shears. I'm jealous of you, all of you, even Smith. Your barren patches of soil. But at the same time, I'm not jealous because you kill its seeds. I embrace them. When I was down there, stumbling through the darkness among terrible beasts, it killed me. Killed and reshaped me like the plow does a field so I could be sowed. The seeds have just begun sprouting, and soon I will be as wonderful as those beasts. Smith could never do that. He would sooner die. But you could. Right now you are a shell. But if you just walk among the trees, you could become so much more.
She stared at me expectantly as if she was waiting for me to jump up and run into the forest at that moment. I'm content as a ranger. I don't need anything more than that. Grace's smile faded, and she almost looked sane.
I understand. One day you will. Joining me is a far more gracious fate than choosing to leave. Daniel's learned that, and you will too. Goodbye, Jack.
She was too far gone for reasoning. I tried the door again, and it was unlocked. I left the research office and went to clock in for work as if nothing had happened. That night, I woke up to Smith pounding on my door. "Ranger Jackson, come out here right now." I got up, quickly pulled on my ranger uniform, and opened the door. I was met with the barrel of a gun, my gun. Instinctively, my hands shot into the air. Smith looked mad. "Come out of the cabin and walk to the research building." I did what I was told. There's not much you can do when someone has a gun pointed to the back of your head. He guided me through the halls of the research center back to the room where Grace was being held. There were drops of blood around the base of the door, which was wide open. Grace wasn't in the room anymore, but the handcuffs had never been unlocked. On the interrogation table was her arm, laying in a pool of blood and covered in bite marks from where she had chewed it off. On the wall behind where she had sat, scrawled in blood, was a note that read, "See you soon, Jack." I felt the cold barrel of the gun slam into the nape of my neck, and Smith said, "Look, see what you did? You freed her and she ran right back into the forest." "I didn't free her, she chewed—" "Shut it. I don't know what you did, but she asked for you and you're the last person she talked to. One thing is right though, you will be seeing her soon. She's in the forest somewhere and you're either going to find her or I'm going to kill you. Which will it be, Jackson?" My mind was racing for any way out of the situation. Both options were a death sentence, but one afforded me a little more time. Smith marched me to the East Stream entrance and handed me a headlamp. Under the dark of night, the forest is much more foreboding. Every zone has the same light level, so it's almost impossible to know just where you are outside of measuring the width of tree trunks. The only person I knew who had done a night dive was Ranger Daniels, and he told me that, just like in the ocean, deep animals come up for food in the darkness. I started down the stream, every sound making me flinch. As I swung my flashlight around, I thought I saw eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness. Now and again, I could have sworn I saw something moving with me just at the edge of my flashlight beam. Eventually, I made it to the point where I usually turn tours around, and I stopped. If I thought there was a chance I would die going this far, then going further is like digging myself a grave. Suddenly, I heard movement further down the stream, distinctly human movement. I steeled myself and walked into the unknown. I followed those footsteps for over an hour, deeper and deeper into the forest. Eventually, the sound started coming from my north, and I had to stray off the stream and into the tree line. It was only a few more minutes until I saw her, curled up with her head between her knees at the base of a tree the width of a building. "Grace, you need to come with me." She slowly looked up at me, and her mouth stretched into an unnaturally toothy grin.
Ranger Jackson, I told you you'd be seeing me soon. I'm not coming with you. You're coming with me.
She stood, and I finally got a good look at her. She had changed since I last saw her. Her sickly gray skin was loose and hung off her body like a burlap sack. The place where she had chewed her arm off had already healed, and a sharp piece of bone stuck out from the stump. Her eyes looked rough, like they were made out of stone, and her irises had gone almost white, giving her eyes the appearance of marble spheres with holes drilled in them. At that moment, I decided that maybe getting shot to death wasn't that bad of a way to go and took off running. But before I could make it more than 10 feet, she was on top of me. My head slammed against the forest floor, and stars filled my vision. I tried scrambling away, but she jabbed the broken bone sticking out of her arm through my calf and started dragging me deeper into the forest. My vision swam from the pain, but I knew passing out meant potentially never waking up again. So I gave up struggling against her to save energy. I'm unsure exactly how long I was being dragged before I noticed a deer standing behind a tree just ahead of us, watching us. Grace noticed it too and stopped, yelling some nonsense at it. This seemed to scare it, and it ducked out of sight. Grace huffed in annoyance and continued dragging me, but there it was again, standing behind a different tree, only its head peeking out, just watching us. Grace stopped and yelled again, and the deer disappeared again, just to reappear on the other side of us moments later. She seemed to be getting extremely agitated, and she pulled my leg off her arm, letting it fall with a very painful thud. She ran full speed at the deer, yelling profanities, but this time the deer didn't move. She lunged at it and it dodged out of her way, leaving her sprawled on the ground. In that moment, I saw fear, real fear, cross her face as the deer reared up and its body split open, revealing rows of molars before coming down and engulfing her whole. Muffled screams emanated from its body for a moment until a sickening crunch silenced them forever. It continued chewing, the awful sound of Grace's body being rent to slurry for several minutes as I laid in shock, pain, and fear on the ground where she had left me. Once it was done, it convulsed, body distorting as it swallowed the mush into a larger body somewhere just out of sight, and turned towards me. It walked out into the open and seemed to never end. Leg after leg with horribly twisted hooves attached to a flattened, hairy body emerged from behind the tree as it walked towards me. When it was right over me, I felt its hot breath on my head as it sniffed me. Then, by some miracle, it moved on. It walked right up to the base of a tree, and its malformed hooves crimped into the bark, allowing it to climb up the tree. It moved like a centipede, and it took quite some time before the whole body, which ended in a flat tuft of fur, disappeared into the darkness above me. I didn't move for a long time, but eventually I stood and limped south, back towards the stream. I felt like I was in a dream as I made my way back towards the surface. It wasn't until I was well into the sunlight zone, barely brightened by the pre-dawn twilight, that I remembered Smith was going to kill me. When I got to the edge of the forest, there he was, sitting on a log in the clearing. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I ducked into the tree line and made my way south, just within sight of the clearing, until I could just barely make out the roof of my cabin through the trees. Then, I made a break for it. Smith saw me and fired off a few rounds, which missed. I made it back inside, grabbed my lamp off the desk by my bed, and waited for Smith. He burst through my door and one swing knocked him out cold. Smith left Forest National Park that day. He didn't tell anyone, leave a note, or even take anything more than the clothes on his back. Everyone was surprised. He had worked there for decades and had no inclination to leave. He wandered back into the park that night with no memories, a concussion, and a red welt on his head. It's a miracle that he survived. Even the normal Canadian wilderness is a force to be reckoned with. Andy, our honorary on-site medic, said that he must have passed out when his memories went and cracked his head on the road. Smith stayed with us, though he's a completely different man now. He relearned all his research and does frequent dives to learn more about the forest. I don't join him anymore. As for Grace, her car got taken away by the government guys a few months ago. To be honest, when they did, I hoped it would be my last time thinking about her. But here we are. Despite her delusions, the forest isn't a gardener, it's a lumberjack, cutting down healthy trees to plant invasive species. It's just started to snow as I'm typing this. There should be fewer visitors now that winter is really setting in. I won't have to go into that damned forest as often, and maybe I'll have more time to write stories like these. Oh, one last thing. If any of you visit the park and have a lamp with you for some reason, I'll buy it off you. Julie won't get me a new one. Until next time. Hello people, I want to thank you for watching until the end. The stories from this national park are an ongoing series, and at the moment, I'm waiting for the next story. Please let me know in the comments below if you'd like to hear more about this national park. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next story.